Tonight, historic peace talks. Secretary of State Marco Rubio meets with Russian leaders to discuss the end of fighting in Ukraine. The talks to begin talks. Plus,
the damage speaks for itself. Here at one of the country's largest thermal power plants.
As talks begin, Russia continues to attack Ukraine's power grid, leaving millions in the dark. A report from Kharkiv, Ukraine. And the cuts keep coming. As protests pop up in cities across the country, the latest from President Trump and efficiency czar Elon Musk as they attempt to scale back the federal government. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. High-stakes diplomacy takes center stage as the world watches to see what happens next. Good evening in Washington, I'm Jenna Browder. A path towards peace. That was one of the main discussions in a historic meeting today between Secretary of State Marco Rubio, his Russian counterpart, and several other top U.S. and Russian officials. The two nations meeting in Saudi Arabia to begin working toward an end to the war in Ukraine. Noticeably absent from the negotiating table were European allies and Ukraine. National security correspondent Caitlin Burke has been following the U.S.-Russia talks. Caitlin, what was the goal of this first meeting?
Jenna, this meeting was the start of a conversation. Joining Secretary Rubio at the table were National Security Advisor Michael Waltz and Special Mideast Envoy Stephen Witkoff. The main focus was on ending the war with Ukraine, but the U.S. is also looking to reopen both diplomatic and economic ties with Russia.
We're going to appoint our teams respectively to work very quickly to reestablish the functionality of our respective missions in Washington and in Moscow. For us to be able to continue to move down this road, we need to have diplomatic facilities that are operating and functioning normally.
Rubio said this initial meeting was constructive and that he believes Russia is ready to work towards peace.
I came away today convinced that they are willing to begin to engage in a serious process to determine how and how quickly and through what mechanism can an end be brought to this war.
Jenna?
Yeah, Caitlin, did Secretary Rubio say why this meeting was only between the U.S. and Russia?
Well, it's definitely a sore spot, with Ukraine and our European allies voicing concern over being sidelined. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his country will not accept the outcome of any talks Kyiv doesn't take part in. But Rubio says nothing was settled today, and the U.S. has plans to talk to both sides.
The goal is to bring an end to this conflict in a way that's fair, enduring, sustainable, and acceptable to all parties involved.
The meeting today was also meant to pave the way for a meeting between President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. According to National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, that could happen in the next several weeks, but a date has not yet been set. Jenna?
All right, National Security Correspondent Caitlin Burke, thank you. Well, as these negotiations begin, Russia continues to attack Ukraine's power grid, causing rolling blackouts for millions of Ukrainians facing bitter winter temperatures. Chuck Holton reports from Kharkiv.
While Russia has targeted the electrical grid here since the start of the war, bombardments have focused in recent months on critical power infrastructure. The damage speaks for itself. Here at one of the country's largest thermal power plants, after 7 cruise missiles destroyed these huge generators, now workers are scrambling to salvage whatever they can.
We have been visiting, in fact, nine stations that are critical for the safe functioning of the nuclear power plants. And of course, the situation is quite dire. We should not hide the fact, and as you can see behind us, this infrastructure has been degraded.
Nuclear power provides much of the electricity here, and those plants rely on a functional grid to operate safely. Experts warn damage to key substations could force reactors to shut down, leading to a full-blown energy crisis.
A nuclear accident can come with a direct attack on a nuclear power plant, but it can also be the result of a disruption in the power grid. And this substation is a critical part of that network that you have here in Ukraine. So when a substation like this is affected or is prevented from operating in a normal way, then you can have a very serious situation.
This thermal power generation plant was one of the largest ones in the entire Kyiv region, and it was completely destroyed in April by a Russian missile strike. Some of the machines in there are so large and they were so totally destroyed, they're probably never going to be able to repair them. And so they're going to a new kind of strategy, which is to create a distributed power generation network all over the country that will make it much harder for Russia to knock out.
This spring, Russia destroyed 100% of our generation facility. So today we invite all investors with some unique proposal. We want to get dozens of small generators from 10 till 25, 30 megawatts.
As Ukraine works to rebuild its infrastructure, the human cost of the war continues to rise. Almost 13 million Ukrainians, more than a third of the population, will need humanitarian aid this year. As negotiations pick up, boosted by the new Trump administration, power company employees work to keep the lights on.
We have very experienced personnel, we have all grids, we have natural gas, we have everything. So we want to invite investors to deploy these small generators in our power station. But most important, what we can provide for investors to attract them, we will buy 100% electricity, but they will produce.
At a recent UN meeting, the U.S. explained what is at stake.
For the sake of peace, we allowed Russia to hold 20% of Georgia. For the sake of peace, we allowed Russia to occupy Crimea. We all want peace, but an outcome that rewards Putin for Russia's aggression is no peace at all.
From Kharkiv, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Thank you, Chuck. To the Middle East tonight, where new unexpected momentum is speeding up the release of Israeli hostages. Hamas is preparing to return 10 Israelis this Saturday, 6 hostages who are still alive, and the bodies of 4 who died in captivity. According to the Associated Press, one Israeli official says Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's decision to permit mobile homes and construction equipment into Gaza helped to accelerate their release. Meanwhile, U.S. senators traveled to Israel to mark the 500th day since the October 7th terrorist attack on Israel. Lawmakers expressed differing views about President Trump's proposal to depopulate and rebuild Gaza.
I will work with Israel to find countries that would host Palestinians if they choose to leave. But we're not talking about a forced exodus.
The plan that the Arab states will offer to President Trump provides a realistic prospect for normalizing relations, self-determination by the Palestinians, regional defense arrangements, and security for Israel.
Meanwhile, Egypt is working on a plan that would not require the removal of Palestinians while rebuilding Gaza's infrastructure. And for more on this, let's bring in Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Michael, welcome. So what do you make of these latest developments and what seems to be new momentum for getting these hostages home?
Well, it is good news. And, you know, it makes sense there would be this kind of incremental progress. Both sides benefit from this at least temporary ceasefire. Let's all hope and pray that it can be extended into a durable peace, but no one's committing to that just yet. The logic here, of course, is that for Hamas, getting more aid into the Gaza Strip and getting a moment to regroup or breathe is worth it for them. And for Israel, getting the hostages home is crucial for them. But neither side has really fundamentally changed its view, and there's no alternative yet that's developed for the Palestinian people to be represented by a group besides Hamas, which of course is what we really need as a solution to this problem long term, together with an Israeli willingness to help the Palestinians create a new state on some part of the territory where most of the Palestinian people currently live. So I think on this topic, my own view is that President Trump's offer by itself on its own terms is a non-starter. Now maybe it can be shifted, transformed into something that's much more promising if it becomes a rebuilding for Gaza for the Palestinians. But I think you need those pieces. You need a different kind of Palestinian representative, and then maybe that's the Palestinian Authority that currently rules in the West Bank or something else on the Gaza Strip. and then you need a two-state solution of some kind. Until we get those things, yes, we'll get a few hostages released. Yes, we'll have a temporary extension of the ceasefire, but it won't last.
Two-state solution is still on the table.
Well, it's not really if you talk to anybody in the region, unfortunately, because in Israeli politics, of course, they're still so horrified by October 7th, and rightly so, that they don't see any way in which you could ever do a deal like this and allow Palestinian entity to have power so close to your own territory. And they don't trust the Palestinians to replace Hamas with a more viable group. But, you know, the Palestinian people also aren't so sure about peace with Israel. Certainly Hamas never has been. The Palestinian Authority is willing to do that, but it doesn't have that much influence, and Israel has weakened the Palestinian Authority with all the settlements in the West Bank. So if your question was meant to skeptically imply that there isn't much of a basis for this idea right now, you're right. But if there's an alternative, I'd like to know it. I just don't see any way you solve this problem without the Palestinians at some point having their own country in more or less the general region where they are today.
Michael, I want to talk to you about the war in Ukraine as well, and talks between the United States and Russia, talks essentially to begin talks. Zelensky says he will not accept an ultimatum from the United States and Russia. Your thoughts on his comments today?
Well, I think he's right in the sense that, of course, Ukraine is going to want to have a say in its own future. I think President Zelensky has to very carefully calibrate how to deal with President Trump in particular, because obviously Zelensky needs Trump and needs the rest of the Western leaders for security assistance, for economic assistance. You don't want to find yourself in a disagreement. And we know that President Trump can sometimes react fairly strongly to these kinds of debates that happen in public. So, you know, I think Zelensky is right on the substance, and I would typically encourage him to use slightly softer language as a way to make the point. But I understand why he said it. He sees two countries, you know, thousands of miles away from his own, down in Saudi Arabia, negotiating the beginning of a process that may not include Ukraine even down the road as a way to try to settle the war. That doesn't seem quite right. But I think the way to handle this is to say we're going to need to make sure our own concerns are met in some kind of a process. I would put it in those kind of terms myself.
Yeah. Okay, Michael O'Hanlon with the Brookings Institute. We're out of time this evening, but we always love having you on. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jenna.
Still to come tonight, the DOGE drama and Democrats' plan to fight against it. The battle lines are taking shape. We'll take a look at that next. Welcome back. We are continuing to track the Trump administration's DOGE effort as President Trump and Elon Musk work to reshape and downsize the federal government. The top Social Security official has stepped down in protest after Musk's team requested access to sensitive personal data about millions of Americans. The recent moves are stirring reaction around the country and on Capitol Hill. That's where we find CBN's Michelle London tonight. Michelle?
Well, Jenna, here on the Hill, the House is in recess this week, but Democrats are hard at work organizing local protests through what they're calling 9 days of visibility. It's an effort where House members host community events highlighting what they're calling the devastating impacts of Trump and Musk actions. Earlier, during a Fox News interview, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded to those efforts. Take a listen.
Now you see the Democrat Party and the mainstream media spiraling out of control about a very simple promise, rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse from our federal bureaucracy. This is a promise President Trump campaigned on. He is now delivering on it.
Meanwhile, the Social Security Department is reeling from some abrupt changes after 30 years. Acting Commissioner Michelle King stepped down from her role at the agency after refusing to give DOGE access to sensitive Social Security information. This as more than a dozen agencies across the federal government saw sudden layoffs. The Department of Housing and Urban Development's union warns they expect a 50% cut to the workforce by May. And with tax season just around the corner, as many as 15,000 workers at the IRS face possible termination. As sources close to the agency say, the White House has already replaced King as acting commissioner with Leland Dudek, who currently works at the SSA. So far, DOGE has accessed Treasury payment systems and is attempting to access Internal Revenue Service databases. Here in Washington, as more firings loom, there is this sense of uncertainty, Jenna, among government workers as many watch and wait for more information. Jenna.
Certainly. All right. On Capitol Hill correspondent Michelle London. Thank you, Michelle. In other news, all but 2 of 21 passengers injured in a Delta plane crash in Canada have been released from hospitals. The flight from Minneapolis to Toronto had 76 passengers and 4 crew members on board when it crashed and flipped upside down upon arrival. It was in flames. Emergency workers hosed it down on the snowy runway and got everyone out in what some officials have called a miracle. The cause of the crash is under investigation. Well, much of the United States is dealing with extreme winter weather. A polar vortex gripped the Rockies and northern plains, bringing extreme cold temperatures as cold as negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit in parts of North Dakota. Meanwhile, deadly flooding in Kentucky. The governor confirmed 12 deaths there following severe storms. And the South and Mid-Atlantic are now bracing for a burst of snow Wednesday into Thursday. Still to come, signs of life after more than a year of war in the Middle East. See how a park reopening is bringing hope to in the midst of so much uncertainty. While Israelis have suffered in many ways since the start of the war, so have the country's forests and animals. CBN News Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl traveled to an important park that's reopened after more than a year.
Less than 20 miles from the Lebanese border, Agamon HaHula Park is known as a bird watcher's paradise. In good times, the Hula Valley can host millions of migrating birds and thousands of visitors each year. Closed since October 2023, it's been very quiet, with no statistics on how the war affected the bird migration. Now things are looking up.
After more than a year of being closed due to the war, missiles, and forest fires, the Agamon Hula Park is now ready to reopen and welcome visitors from around Israel and around the world.
It symbolizes the rehabilitation of the north of Israel and the coming back home of the citizens that supposed to left in the middle of the night 1 year ago.
Ifat Ovadia Lusky of the KKL Jewish National Fund oversees Israel's forests and is helping to rebuild communities here. She says although northern Israel has never experienced anything like this, hope is strong.
We have the evacuees people and the fires, and this site was closed more than a year. It means that thousands of visitors couldn't come to here.
CBN News joined a tour of the affected areas recently. The park's visitors center contains interactive exhibits, and there is an option to walk or tour the grounds in a vehicle. The war throughout northern Israel damaged around 5,000 acres of forests.
We had a lot of streams and springs, aquatic environments that were polluted, and open areas that were polluted by oil and benzene from the army vehicles. In the forest that was burned, we saw that animals were hurt.
Chief scientist Dr. Doron Markel says, although they don't know how the birds handled the war overall, the cranes seem to be doing well.
There are thousands of cranes wintering here as usual, and even more than last year. So the nature wins it all.
Itamar Katz, head forester of the Golan Heights, says the war has kept his crews busy.
More than a third of all of our forests burned. If we talk about open areas, we're talking 4 times what I just said.
Sadly, the biggest culprit behind the forest fires, he says, has been Israel's interceptor rockets.
They created so many fires. I mean, they saved countless amounts of lives. But if we were used to getting one rocket fall in one forest and start one fire, then you had 3 or 4 interceptors, which started 20 or 30 spot fires. It was a very different situation.
Often preventing them from doing their job.
We weren't always allowed to go to the fire at the end of the day, and sometimes we were just told, listen, it's too dangerous, it's too close to the border, and we just needed to let it burn.
Head veterinarian Rona Nadler-Valenci started to treat animal patients primarily injured by human presence when the Agamon Wildlife Rehabilitation Center opened about 5 years ago.
So it can be road traffic accidents, and it can be collision with power lines, can be poison from agriculture, from various other things. It can also be gunshot wounds. We take in patients that have been injured, and we nurse them and rehabilitate them back and release them to nature.
Before the war, the center had been growing.
And then the war kicked in, and we had to learn how to work in a very different reality. So in the beginning, all of our staff, including myself, we had to evacuate because we're all from here, from the Galilee.
Thus, the center had to close.
In fact, we had to release all of the animals and hope for the best. But eventually, we just came back because we really needed to be here for the animals.
When it reopened, they didn't see many patients because there were no people to bring in the animals. Only soldiers in the war zones found them.
We saw a lot of injuries that are related to the war. So if it would be collisions with Army vehicles or animals entrapped in fire zones.
Now KKL Jewish National Fund is shifting gears, looking toward the future. Valenci says they hope to build a new animal hospital.
A new hospital so that we can have an impact, a greater impact, and take in more patients and treat more animals every year and release them back to nature.
Markle told CBN News reopening the visitor center is an important step.
It can be a day of change, a day that we will start the reclamation and rehabilitation, not only of people, but also the nature. The key here is to study before you do, and when you do it better. We call it Build Back Better.
Julie Stahl, Agamon Hahula Park, Northern Israel.
Still ahead, a unifying message in Congress. Next on Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a unifying tradition in the United States Senate. Today, Senator Roger Wicker read President George Washington's 1796 farewell address aloud. It's a tradition that dates back to the 1800s, and it alternates between members of each political party. The message about unity, of course, is still relevant today. And that's going to do it for Faith Nation this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great night.